I'm going to be talking to Ben Kujala, the Director of Power Planning for the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, about the effect of the mega drought and the wildfires on the Pacific Northwest power grid. But this is interesting because it's not just the immediate impacts, what's happening, over the last couple of years and this summer, but also what about long-term planning, which has been specialty. So welcome to the interview, Ben.
Thank you.
Well, look, why don't we start with the immediate term? We remember what happened last year. It was awful, particularly in California. Looks like the drought is actually in temperatures a little worse this year. So in terms of drought and wildfire effect on the Pacific Northwest power grid, where are we at?
Well, certainly it's having an impact. As we look through the data, we look the way that power is flowing throughout the grid, we're seeing some of the impacts of fires. So there was a time, probably 2 or 3 days, where there's a really large derate of the transmission capability between the Northwest and California that was basically directly because of a fire. And then there's certainly been a lot of pretty high record-setting load events where we're seeing places, local areas, and also broader records being broken in terms of the amount of electricity use for air conditioning and things like that, that just exceeded the historic experience that we've had.
Now, my understanding is that the California in particular has added a tremendous amount of battery storage to help with the with this issue. And there's been some talk about demand response to enable utilities and planners to shift load. Has that helped at all?
Certainly, if you go to the California ISO website, you can see basically every single day how they're using and deploying batteries in their system to help balance out all kinds of system needs. So they're during the middle of the day, they're charging up when you have a lot of solar energy. During the evening ramp and the morning ramp, you see them deploying more, generally more towards the evening ramp. But every day is a little bit different, and it's been pretty amazing to see the amount grow so quickly within that context. So if you went a year back, you would see hardly anything, and now there's, I think, almost 1,000 megawatts or more just within the California ISO system that's being deployed. And there's probably more batteries and more storage behind inverters on solar plants. So the total amount of storage down there is really kind of astonishing. And it's been a very quick ascent. It's really, the circumstances on the ground this year are completely different than what was in place last year. And to see that kind of change in a single year is pretty astonishing.
Now, this is a good segue into the long-term planning. So as somebody who's involved in long-term planning for the Pacific Northwest power grid, how's your planning process, or the things you're planning for, has it changed? Where are you at? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think the long-term planning challenges, we've known for a while now that we were getting into a realm where we need to start looking at whether it was kind of beyond our historic experience. So I think 2 years ago, we started really emphasizing changing over to the climate models and being able to look at weather projection from climate models so that you would have maybe a broader range. And actually, most people think of it as warming. So of course, they're looking at the hotter summers, but the truth is climate models show hotter summers, they show colder winters. It's actually just a bigger range of potential temperatures that can impact the use of electricity. And so we switched over to those probably a couple of years ago and started really intently folding those into our planning process rather than being kind of a scenario or a secondary thing. It's the primary way that we look forward and plan for the electric grid now. But of course, now we've had the heat dome experience, and we had temperatures that were far higher, far earlier than what we saw in the projections, even for those climate models, which had a broader range than our previous history. So I think a lot of people are looking back at how we've planned and kind of what we think extremes are and how likely extremes are for planning. And it's hard because, of course, you need the sort of science and the data and the information available to us to catch up if there is adjustments needed for an event like that heat dome event. but it also gives us another point to compare to on the historic record, where we can go back and say, these are things we've experienced. And I think it just changes the way people see the likelihood of those extremes.
What does that mean in practical terms? And I'm thinking primarily in terms of the future of natural gas in your generation mix, the future of batteries. Will Pacific Northwest go the same route as California? The future of hydro. You get a lot of hydro power from hydro. And if you're in a drought, that's not good news for hydro dams. So what's your take on that?
The Columbia system is really different when it comes to hydro. So, I mean, when you hear about things like on the Colorado or Hoover Dam, where you have this persistent long-term drought that has been there for years and years and has really impacted that area, it turns into something that is a longer-term trend. The Columbia system really, all the way from up in Canada down through, the mouth of the Columbia that comes out, it doesn't have the ability to store water for that long. And so it really is every year you kind of have the precipitation and the rainfall and the snowpack that sets up what you're going to get for that year. And so for us, the important thing is understanding when the precipitation is going to happen, how much of it's going to fall as snowpack, when it's going to come off, and if you're going to see more water coming down during the winter because rain on snow events or just having warmer weather in general in the winter, and if you're going to have drier conditions in the summer because you don't have snowpack and you might have less precipitation. And so a lot of our sort of look at how the hydro system has adapted in our region is about trying to capture those bigger trends. But you also need to understand the system is moving very dynamically underneath. We have a lot of solar and a lot of batteries being installed in California. That's having an immediate and noticeable impact on how power flows. In the Western grid, we see there are times, even in this July, where we've had extreme temperatures, where California during the solar peak is exporting power to the rest of the West. And California exporting power is something that has been almost unheard of, in the past. And so I think there's a lot of things that are moving, and the drought and the hydro conditions that come from that is one of the things that you need to adapt to. Storage coming in and being a more predominant technology is certainly, it's early, but it's something that's becoming more predominant. But the sort of continued pace of solar development is probably one of the bigger stories, and certainly a huge impact on how we use the hydro system and how we use the other pieces of the power system throughout the Northwest and actually throughout the entire West.
Could you look ahead maybe 10 years for us, say 2030? How will the Pacific Northwest power grid have changed from the way it is today?
Well, if you look at the legislation that's out there for Oregon and Washington, certainly we would expect to have more renewables installed by 2030 in this region directly. Certainly our neighbors, I think California and New Mexico, a lot of the other states throughout the West have requirements as well, where they're going to have a lot more renewables installed too. And people are moving towards goals to be 100% clean in power. And so Oregon has one by 2040, Washington has one by 2045, certainly California has one by 2045. So if people are on pace by 2030, I think you're going to see a grid with a lot of renewables installed. The existing generation will still be there. We'll still have gas plants. We certainly will still have the hydro system. But I think the way that you operate that existing system might be pretty different, because it will be really adapting itself to the renewables that have been added into the system and trying to make up for when those renewables are not available and not there to meet electric load.
So is that where we can look forward to gas being used as peaker plants, or when at times when renewables are not online, and a lot more battery storage? Is that kind of the direction the grid's going?
I think it's at least partially the direction it's going, but I mean, you certainly still need reserves, and you need a lot of kind of a balance of resources. We can't just turn off everything during the middle of the day when the sun is highest without having, batteries, gas plants, or things that are there ready to respond to provide all the services. It's not just about generating electricity. It's about, keeping the system in balance and all the things that go along with that. So I think that there's a mix of, potentially curtailing renewable resources and being able to back off and increase the output from those because you're at a lower point and you've had to curtail a little bit of the power that could have been produced. There's probably reserves that are absolutely going to be provided from the hydro system in our region, and reserves from the thermal system as long as it's there. I mean, there's been a lot of investment in building the transmission system and the thermal system and all these resources to be able to support the electric grid. And I imagine that we're going to continue to use that investment through the life of those plants as we are moving towards a lot of the targets that people put out.
Final question, Ben. What about the role of demand response? That's something that we've seen a lot of talk about in California, and the California system operator, as they've got some proponents on the board there, like Severin Borenstein, who are big on that. Is that going to play a significant role in the Pacific Northwest?
It's a little harder in the Pacific Northwest, quite honestly, because the hydro system and kind of the flexibility of the system interplays with that. And so classic demand response products tend to be kind of your peaking capacity needs being met. And in California, I think you've got a blend of batteries and demand response and a lot of different strategies to kind of deal with that. We certainly see that there are, especially some frequently deployable demand response products like voltage regulation, where you're kind of working within the existing bandwidth that's set for voltage and able to kind of increase load or decrease load dynamically. Those sort of things are very useful and could provide a lot of value for the region. But the sort of traditional capacity demand response, we have some in our region. Idaho Power has a long history of running a lot of programs that help with summer peaks. And I expect we'll continue to see some of that maintained and maybe even expanded a bit. But as a product, it's really hard to have a market in the Northwest where, next year we could have a really large water year and you're going to have no real signal basically for demand response in those circumstances. It's really set by the hydro year, and that's always been a challenge for demand response in our region. And I think it continues to be a challenge going forward as you look at the grid.
Ben, thank you very much for this. Always appreciate your insights.
Of course. Thank you for having me.